Hello. Okay, wonderful. Good day, everyone, both here in the Ocean Pavilion and online. I'm Mark Shimamoto, Vice President for Global Outreach and Partnerships for AGU. And I know this is just the very first day of COP, but I just wanted to say how excited I am to see all of the energy and engagement we're already seeing here in Dubai. While I'm hearing talk of big partnerships, solution science, and the need for, of course, a true blue economy. Make no mistake, these conversations are urgent. They're vital to overcoming our climate crisis. The truth is that there's no way to overplay the ocean's impact on our lives. That is especially true for people who live on the coast. Growing up in California, I saw firsthand the role ocean plays in coastal communities. It's a source of sustenance, a place of recreation, a hub of commerce, and a center of culture. We're also taught to respect the ocean as a force of nature. Its great power, its size, but human-caused climate change has introduced another threat, rising sea levels. In regions throughout the world, sea level rise is eroding shorelines, worsening coastal flooding, and threatening ecosystems and groundwater aquifers. Recent research coming out of AGU's scholarly journals make clear the challenges that lie ahead. That in some coastal areas, destructive so-called 100-year floods will become more frequent in the decades to come. And that rise in sea level will in turn cause rising groundwater to inundate some coastal contaminated sites, mobilizing pollutants and threatening communities' health and safety. There is no question that research published in AGU and other scientific journals are powerful tools that have turned the spotlight on the dangers of climate change. Yet at AGU, we also believe in the power of science to create solutions. And today, we're talking about solutions grounded in community science. Community science happens when communities and scientists work together to advance local priorities. And that's exactly what AGU's Thriving Earth Exchange program has been doing for the past 10 years. Since 2013, Thriving Earth Exchange has launched more than 250 projects around the world focused on building a healthier, more resilient, and just future. Take, for example, one project in the Philippines. Community leaders from coastal areas near Manila Bay worked with scientists to map the impacts of land reclamation projects on the fishing communities and the environment. Together, they developed plans to oppose reclamation, advocate for relocation, and reduce the risks from climate change. Another project in the Dominican Republic, scientists worked with community leaders to identify that waste was polluting a river and its ocean outlet. The pollution was damaging coral reefs, which were serving that community as a protective barrier against storm surges. Scientists trained the community in water sampling and worked with leaders on educational outreach and a cleanup strategy. And so these are just two examples what Thriving Earth Exchange has done to open doors for opportunities for scientists and communities to create change at the local level. However, there's still so much work to be done. And luckily, many hands are involved in this effort. And so that's why I'm thrilled to be joined on stage today by colleagues from other organizations that are advancing solutions work through their community, through community science and the like. We're going to learn more about their work, gain insights into why community science is critical for driving solutions to climate change, and hear about the next steps to further grow this important movement. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce our panel, and then we will jump into a nice discussion. So first, we have Tomohiro Oda, who is a senior scientist at the University Space Research Association and also co-chair of the OPTICA-AGU Global Environmental Measurement and Monitoring Initiative. Thank you for joining us, Tomohiro. And then next, we have Alexandra Ramos Valle, a project scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR, in Boulder, Colorado, USA. Welcome, Alexandra. And we have not just one, but two NCAR representatives. We're also pleased to be joined by Christine Shields, who is also serving as a project scientist. Hi, Christine. And then virtually, a slight change in the program, we're joined by Amy Jones, who is an officer of the Urban Research Innovation and Development Team at ICLEI Global. I hope you can hear us and see us. Amy? Wonderful, welcome. And last but not least, a big welcome for Bridget Shea. Bridget is the Commissioner for Travis County, Texas, USA. So thank you for being here, and another important perspective on how communities are tackling the climate crisis. So entering into the discussion, and I'll move after I pose this question to the panel, but each of you are doing so much important work to advance both climate action through community science and also taking action yourselves. So I was kind of looking forward to hearing through this conversation and learning more about your background, your initiatives, and lived experiences. So my first question to each of you is, can you kind of describe a little bit more about the work you're doing and how you see community knowledge and the context of communities being a vital player to creating local solutions? So with that, maybe I'll start with you, Tomohiro.
So, hi everyone, I'm Tomohiro, the University Space Research Association in Washington, D.C. I've been working on almost my entire career, more than 10 years, on greenhouse gas emission from city and the power plants, big emitters, using remote sensing data. Then obviously that naturally interested in more about what's happening in cities, then how we can mitigate emission from cities. That has been the biggest focus. Then, as introduced earlier, I co-chair the new initiative GEMM, Global Environmental Monitoring and Measurement and Monitoring Initiative, which is the collaboration between OPTICA and also AGU. And that is a really unique initiative because we bring in the power of the photonics and also the optics, which is a key component of the environment sensing. And AGU, obviously the pioneer of the community science. And climate change is really the big issue, the global scale and some regional scale, really big compared to what like we are, like individual, compared to our scale, quite small. But the local solution could be only locally happening, also acting the same way. So what we're doing is building community. Basically, people are bringing in people, such as the scientists, researcher, also not just our natural scientists, but also including social scientists and industry people, also policy practitioners, and have a conversation and trying to grow the community around the world. So last year, luckily, I co-chaired chaired the summit in Asia in Singapore, and where we have, again, more than 50 different diverse people from different countries from Asia. And we see huge diversity in there. Then the conversation a little bit like a mess, but that's actually what we expected. We scientists speak in certain languages, and the policy people speak in certain languages, but we actually looking the same thing. And what we're trying to do in the GEM is that trying to converge and trying to find a local solution. Then we center the local people as a core of our project because local people know the best. That we are trying to serve for them using science. That's what we're doing so far.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. I'm a scientist at NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research. In my personal research, I study storm surges, and that comes from personal experience of growing up in an island that's very susceptible to tropical cyclones and basically seeing that devastation growing up. I'm here more in my capacity as a program coordinator for the Early Career Faculty Innovator program, or just innovators that we have at NCAR. In this program, we partner faculty from social sciences with some of our NCAR staff to work on interdisciplinary and convergent science research projects, which of course include the component of community, and that for us really has a kind of very broad definition. So we're talking about stakeholders, we're talking about actual community members, so people who live there, local leaders, and it's really different and varied in the projects that we look at. I'm very excited to be here in this conversation because really connections to the community is at the center of what we do with the Innovator program. We have a strong focus on co-development, and co-development of these projects really happen at various stages. So there's co-development between social, physical scientists and community before the project begins, as the project progresses, and ultimately as we have certain solutions and outcomes of these projects. And that's kind of an overview of what we're doing, so I will kind of leave it at that.
Hi everyone, I'm Christine. I I am actually a meteorologist by training, and then I transitioned into doing atmospheric science and climate research. My research sort of focuses on extreme events and high impact events, and I focus a lot on what we call the hydrological cycle, which is the Earth's water balance. And I look at things like atmospheric rivers and monsoons, extreme precipitation. I've looked at it sort of in the past. I use models, climate models as my tool. I look at paleoclimate weather. I've looked at current climate weather, and also now future and different climate scenarios. One of the things I actually wanted to highlight, sort of to piggyback off to Alexandra here, is another program we have at NCAR called Rising Voices, Changing Coasts. This is, I'm in the Climate and Global Dynamics Lab, and we have colleagues in CGD, that's our acronym, that pair with indigenous communities in different localities around the US. One of them is Alaska with indigenous communities there, and that focuses a lot on, the cryosphere, which is the ice, the sea ice and the land ice, and how that impacts the communities, which of course is very important for coastal erosion and availability of resources and things. Other regions are Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Gulf Coast states. And so that is a nice, really way of pairing the science with the indigenous communities to try to have this conversation of people who are in vulnerable communities or actually have a part of a say in guiding the science of what we need to do. The other sort of hat, that's sort of my science hat, and I also have a climate policy hat, where I pair with AGU, and I'm part of a program there that interfaces with legislators to try to educate our local policymakers and legislators to craft and pass legislation that is climate friendly and sensible, and to try to help establish policies that will eventually help communities. So that's the policy hat. And at that point, I think I'll pass it over to Bridget.
Wonderful transition. Exactly.
I know, that's what I thought. It was great.
It was perfect. I don't think we planned it that way. I'm the non-scientist in the group, but I'm going to be talking with Christine about all kinds of things. I'm a county commissioner in Austin, Texas. And I view a lot of things through the political realm because that's the realm I work in. But I'm also a former journalist, so I pay a lot of attention to how people talk about things and what messages are used to communicate stuff. And I find so often that there's poor communication around climate issues, and people literally hijack it and turn it into something completely bizarre. We were just talking earlier about how that happened with COVID. Like, who would have thought that it would be this sort of anti-medical, medicine is bad outcome? I frankly never would have imagined that, but I think that's the kind of thing that we do need to prepare for, is that people will intentionally twist and misrepresent things for their own ends. So I think that both community knowledge and context is crucial for talking about a lot of climate-related things. And I also believe strongly that climate is the most politically disruptive and destabilizing force in the modern world. And there are a lot of people out there who will use that to very bad ends. And I think we need to be really clear what a profound threat so much of this constitutes for a healthy political environment. And then I think we've got to really kind of connect the dots for people. I'll just give you a quick example and then hand it over to Amy, I think, yeah. Central Texas is hundreds of miles away from the coast. And so most people there figure sea level rise isn't going to affect me. I don't have to worry about that. But what they don't realize is that when the 7.3 million people who live along the Texas coast have to relocate inland because of sea level rise and storm surge, they're going to be moving to places like Austin. And we're experiencing increasing drought that's drying up our water supply, our drinking water for the community. So nobody's factoring into the long-range planning the reality that we are going to have a whole lot more people moving in because of the need to relocate from coastal areas. And so that's just not even showing up in the planning, in the long-range planning for water and other resources for the area. And people haven't connected the dots to understand that sea level rise will directly affect people living in Austin, because it will have an impact on every aspect of their community: the availability of housing, the cost of housing, the availability of water, the availability of most things. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to Amy Jones.
Thank you. And yeah, apologies on behalf of Poirier. He's really sorry he couldn't make it today, but thank you so much for accommodating me. Thank you, Mark, and the team for accommodating me speaking on his behalf. So community science is an essential aspect of the work that we do at ICLEI. And it means a lot to us because we believe that bottom-up approaches are essential to addressing the climate emergency. And community science is a fantastic mechanism for broader multi-stakeholder collaboration. So we work with local subnational governments. So the creation of actionable local knowledge is really important for decision makers and leaders, the people who we aim to serve through our network. We know that cities are rapidly having to grapple with uncertainty, complexity, being intricate systems shaped by so many interconnecting factors. So with this, they need fit for purpose, actionable knowledge. So from a city planning perspective, local citizens are the people who know the intricacies of their cities best, as has been already said on the panels. So, you know, they're also the ones that will bear the consequences, positive and negative, of the solutions that are implemented. So with this in mind, it's logical that co-creation should be at the forefront of action towards addressing climate change. So that's our ethos with the work that we do, trying to implement city-led research and innovation. And I recently read in a World Bank report that public servants make an estimated 500 million policy decisions each year. So I think this number really sums up how important city-led research is, to make sure that the decisions that are being made are informed decisions that can lead to positive outcomes. And community-led science is a significant resource for addressing the climate emergency, because it simultaneously raises awareness and also collects data as well. So cities need to be made aware of the value of engaging citizens in these processes and how to facilitate collaboration between governments, research institutions, and citizens to frame research that addresses local issues of concern for residents and where decision-making processes could benefit from evidence. So I hope that provides a brief introduction to the work that we do and how we see community science as being very important.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy, and thank you all the panelists for those insights. I think you can kind of see this web coming together, both folks who are considered kind of more on the science spectrum, those who are working in the applied fields, those who are applying and working with communities to help enrich the scientific nature and application, as well as those who are working in policy, working with policymakers to bring science to and policy inform science. And then at the localist level too, some of the kind of challenges, not just to kind of communicate and showcase the ever-reaching impacts and interconnections between what our communities are doing and how climate change is threatening in multiple ways. So I thought, that was a great intro conversation, a lot of questions to follow up, but I'm thinking in the context of when you work at the community level, when you're working with scientists who have gone through a community science program or maybe haven't but are looking to more engage in their communities, thoughtfully, and vice versa, communities who are very interested in contributing to science and engaging in it. What are some of the challenges you kind of see through that, and are there ways that we can learn and encompass skill sets and ways to overcome those challenges and really bring this together so it's not as much of a novel concept, but just a part of what we do as both a community? So I don't know if someone wants to take it first, but maybe I will handle to you, Alexandra.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point. We see this a lot in our program. One of the main things that really comes through for us, I mean, think about our program where there's like communities, there's social scientists, physical scientists. There's already a barrier there to communicate, right? And so there's a barrier to communicate between scientists and then communicate towards the community. And one of the things we talk a lot about with our faculty is the fact that we need to take time to build trust with communities. And that is often taken for granted, or it's just often not possible due to a lot of the cases are funding structures, right? They have a certain time limitation and you only have so much time to work with. But I think the main point is really like, how do you build trust with the community so that they know that they can kind of rely on you to help solve an issue, and not just, having scientists come in and doing some work and then leaving, right? That feels very extractive, and that's something that we don't want to happen, but often does as well. And that's just, I think, one of the many challenges, but I'll let somebody else talk.
Yeah, just following up. So at GEMM, we are inviting not just scientists, but also policy people, and also the community, also the company people as well. And the community needs to be, the solution needs to be self-sustained. Like Alexandra said, we just come in 2 years to do the project, done. Hey, what's next? That's not good. The climate issues continue going. Hopefully, we can stop it quickly. To do so, we really need to create a community within there. Now, including all the players in there. And that's why I think the inclusive community, building inclusive community, each place is so important. Then I want to also go back to my point earlier, because usually the climate change environment issues are kind of in scale is quite big compared to what we can do. So we need to really nail down to the action. And I give you an example, a little bit silly, but I think the best science-based actionable tool is you have here in this room, which is the carbon monoxide monitor. We measure carbon monoxide. If it's beep, what are you going to do? Run away, yeah? Then the climate issue is not that simple, unfortunately. But that's the gap between we have in science, what we can measure, then action. Now, obviously, I'm saying this quite simply, but it's not easy, of course. But I think at first, because we're coming from the measurement side, we need to think about what we can measure. Then also we need to talk with, say, a policy people, what you want to do policy-wise. Then we need to translate into the science measurement, what to measure, what's variable. Sorry, I'm getting a little geek, but what's variable, what's resolution, what's scale. And they don't have to know everything, but we can translate. That's where we are for, right? So that's kind of the filling gap is so important. Again, the solution should be unique. Also, again, phenomena can be really unique to the places. Also, each place's community has the different capacity, also resources. So there's always need a unique solution to these places. So that's why bringing a community and also bringing a big global scale community is so important.
Yeah, I hear the theme of communication here. And one of the key things that has actually popped up in my mind is actually the language we use. Just in the different communities that I have interacted with, and not even just like scientist to community member or scientist to legislator, but just sometimes science from one discipline to science in another discipline, the language we use is a huge barrier. Like I might say a word and it will mean one thing to me and a different thing to Alexandra. And so the step one is just getting on the same page, getting rid of the jargon. One of the things that I had to learn when I started talking to legislators is don't use acronyms, and like some of the words that just trip off my tongue that are sort of jargony, it's second nature to me, but no clue what it means. So you really got to sort of step back and pay attention just to your basic language. That's sort of like step one, and then otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. But anyway, that's my 2 cents.
No, communication is a huge part of it, and so is measuring things, so you have some idea of like what your baseline is. I started work on climate issues 36 years ago in the epicenter of oil and gas in Texas. And a lot of people weren't very receptive to hearing information about how oil and gas and the burning of fossil fuels was killing the planet. So I had to figure out how to talk about it in a way that people could actually hear it. And so I actually, like, for many years, even lost the phrase climate change. And I just talked to people about, and asked people, did they think that their leaders should do what they could within limits to help people get out of harm's way from wildfires and floods and extreme and deadly weather that was destroying their homes and killing people. And I tried this on climate deniers, and they said, well, of course. And I said, perfect. We'll skip the pointless debate about whether or not it's happening, because you see it on the news all the time. It is happening, and you know that you and your family are threatened. So let's focus on what kinds of things we can do to try and minimize the harm. And oh, by the way, some of these things are going to be really expensive, and you are having to pay for all of it. The people who caused this aren't paying for any of it. And do you think that's fair? And again, most people, including climate deniers, would say, well, no, of course that's not fair. And I'm like, perfect. We'll work on lawsuits as well, like we did with the tobacco industry and the opioid industry, and try and hold the people who caused all this harm accountable. So part of it is just sort of trying to figure out how to talk to people about it in a way they can hear. And then the other is also measuring. And we did this at the county with a baseline of understanding what the sources of our greenhouse gas emissions were for just our county operations. That's the starting point, what you have within your control. And we used the ICLEI ClearPath tool, and we identified that and I'm the ICLEI USA board chair, so full disclosure, I'm a big fan of ICLEI. But we used that tool to understand, where we were emitting greenhouse gas emissions from our operations. The largest is, I think, common to most large organizations, and that's the energy that's used to heat and cool and light our buildings. The second largest was tied, second and third were tied, the emissions from our employee commute and the emissions from our fleet vehicles, because we operate a sheriff's department and other kinds of fleet operations. So that helped us figure out, well, okay, now we know where to start. And after we did that first inventory, the pandemic hit, and literally everybody that didn't have to be at work to do their job took their laptop and went home and worked from home. Anybody else have that experience? I think everybody did. So now we know how well remote work works. It's not a theory anymore. We've all lived it, and we know how well it works. So we figured out that solved our traffic congestion problem overnight, literally. And Austin has grown so rapidly, traffic congestion has been a huge problem, and all the solutions take 10 years or longer to implement, and billions of dollars to wrong-headedly widen highways. So anyway, we figured out, well, if we have our non-essential employees working remotely, we can reduce traffic congestion. We actually documented some increase in productivity, huge increase in employee morale, and those last two are the holy grail for most large employers. So we adopted what we believe is the most ambitious remote work policy for any local government in the country, and we have 75% of our eligible, meaning people who don't have to physically be at work to do their job. So the corrections officers in the jail obviously can't phone in their work. They've got to be there in person, and others that are in similar jobs. But 75% of our eligible employees are now working remotely on a permanent basis. So we dramatically reduced our greenhouse gas emissions from our employee commute, and we adopted a policy to convert our fleet vehicles to electric vehicles. So we will be reducing our emissions from that source. And since we didn't have staff filling up our buildings, we've also reduced our emissions from heating and cooling and lighting our buildings because we're not doing that as much. So that started with measurement and then policy.
Wonderful. Amy, did you have anything you wanted to jump in on this question? Anything to
Yeah,
add?
thank you. I think one of the challenges we observe at ICLEI is case study syndrome. So this idea where a city is studied, but it doesn't play an active role, and it really limits the value of the research findings because the city doesn't feel any ownership over the knowledge that's produced. So this is something that we aim to avoid, but I think a fundamental challenge of implementing more community science projects where the subnational government and community groups are involved, I would say that the challenge is time and resources, because this trust needs to be built, and this takes time. It has to happen so that community groups can engage with the local challenges and identify how scientific research could provide benefit in the long term. And I think, unfortunately, in the past, we have seen a dominance of parachute approaches. So the aspect of long-term positive impacts for communities has perhaps been neglected. So I think one area where attention needs to be given in the future would be to identify how community science can benefit from a more long-term perspective, and collaboration with communities can be sustained from the start of the project and beyond as well, so that they feel this sense of ownership when the research project is being established and created, but then also through the research process as well, right up until we get this generation of the knowledge product that can then feed into policy making.
Wonderful. So I've heard some very important concepts that are critical to ensuring community science is successful. We heard communication, localized information, transparency, ways that we can ensure that the generation of knowledge and the inclusion of community voices is the bedrock of how you expand and get more people involved. I am going to turn to the audience next. So if you have questions, start thinking about them. I'm going to ask one last question while you're all thinking about it. There are quite a few people here in the audience. I'm sure there are people online as well, or who may look at it later on demand. But for those who may be interested in getting more involved, you know, maybe a scientist, maybe a local official, maybe just a community member who's wanting to get more involved in this conversation. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what inspired you. What was your route? What led you to take on this, or inspired you to take on this almost additional role to help expand and improve the lives of communities? So I will start with maybe Christine, because she's looking at me directly, and I hope she's ready to inspire.
I don't. That's a long question to answer. Sort of. So I guess what I'll do is I've always been a geek, and I've always been interested in atmosphere and meteorology and science. So that's just something that's always been part of my DNA. So I think what I'll do in terms of inspiration is just talk about what inspired me to get involved with communicating science to policymakers, and this was it was driven by feeling the need to do something with more proactive in terms of addressing like climate action. So I do my science, I publish my papers, I communicate and I interact with my collaborators, but this is sort of like it's sort of slow, and it sort of trickles in, and everything that I do goes into the literature base, and it's used to forward science, which is great. But I wanted something a little more concrete, and so I started to get involved with AGU in terms of their science policy program, and I started out with a program called Voices for Science. And there's two different ways you can do with Voices for Science in AGU. One is a policy track and one is a communication track. And I did the policy track because I was interested in getting laws on the book that were climate sensible. And so that was sort of my inspiration. And I started that, and I just absolutely love it. I feel, even though policy is also a very long game, yeah. I do feel like I'm doing something more concrete, and it just makes me feel good. And so that's a very selfish thing, but I feel like it comes from a little bit of an altruistic, point of view. So
fantastic.
who wants to be next?
Anyone else want to share? Tomohiro?
Thank you. Yeah, to me, it's actually helpful because we take a measurement, also improving our modeling simulation and stuff. And the always question is like, how good is it good enough? We don't really know. Then I studied in Japan. I'm from Japan, and I studied in the environment engineering. So what is the environment? Actually, our life, right? And what is good enough for improving our life? Then now it's a climate change. How good is to address the climate change? Then that really set me another goal. It is definitely not just that one number to say this is the precision, the accuracy of the measurement or modeling system. Then give me more interaction, also the impacts on society. How actually they feel like, I feel like I'm more doing some meaningful to the end of the planet. It's really, for the PhD, it's sometimes difficult to explain to people like, what am I doing for the society? And a really a nice way to contribute to society. The other thing is that the working on with community is really appreciating diversity. I had a great example last year. It's an Asia workshop, but in a country from India to all the way to Japan, we just can't say just Asia. So many diversity in there. Then even if you look at one country, it has a lot to deal with. National circumstances, culture, etc. Then again, think about it. One country, there's so many cities and communities there. It's really diversity about it. And it's still not doing quite well, but how I can map those diversity into my science, it's kind of, to me, like a new challenges. Then I'm really enjoying looking at diversity and trying to find out what we can provide as local solutions. So that's my kind of selfish, the way to work on this stuff.
Thank you for sharing. Bridget.
It was actually a scientist that inspired me to get engaged. It was Dr. James Hansen. Anybody know his name?
Yes.
Yeah, he's like the leading scientist that first sort of, sounded the alarm around climate change. And I was working as a national press secretary in Washington the summer of 1988, and it was front page news in the New York Times. And I remember my eyes popping out reading the story. And then I called other friends in Washington and said, we all have to drop what we're doing right now and work on this issue where we can measure our coffins and get in. It's over unless we do something about this. So his testimony was incredibly powerful and compelling. It was, a huge story. And I dropped what I was doing and I moved to Texas to work on climate issues. So I think that's a really important thing because a lot of scientists have been criticized, and I think that's part of an intentional ploy to try and silence scientists, or get them to talk about their work in very very small or narrow ways instead of in large impactful ways. So I think it's just really important that that we listen to scientists and that they are free to talk about their research and their work in really powerful ways to just help us understand it, the non-scientists. But it really, it was hugely inspiring for me and changed my life.
Wonderful. Do you want to?
Sure. I love to hear that. It's true. I love it. Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was motivation. It's just I didn't want my research to just end in a publication, right? And I mean, if I'm being fully transparent, the research that I do is really not at this interface. It's very hard to transition when you are doing, like as a scientist, if you're on the full like physical side, dynamics and everything, it's very hard to transition. And so the way that I kind of satisfy that is by running this program. So getting involved in other things where I can facilitate this happening and hopefully eventually transition my own research.
A wonderful answer. And hopefully can inspire the change in the culture change in science to do more of the work that you're doing as well and communicating it publicly. Amy, did you have anything you wanted to add from your perspective and your story?
Yeah, Mark. Yeah, it's a big question. I think I'd have to say I had somebody giving a speech who said when you go into work pathways where your primary focus is to help other people, whether it be sustainability or healthcare or anything that serves people, you might not be rich in terms of the money that you make through that, but you will be rich in terms of the experiences you have and the colleagues who you get to work with. And that really has stuck with me. I think that, as Tomohiro said, it's meaningful work that we do. So it does feel it's a privilege to be able to hopefully contribute to some positivity. And I think when you're working at the local level, it's really satisfying to see how things that might feel like small changes or small actions, they really lead to big change. And it's really inspiring to see. Oops,
Wonderful.
Sorry, my doorbell just went off. Apologies if that
No,
sound
no,
troubled.
that was fine. That was a great answer, and thank you all for sharing not selfish stories, but your stories, your journeys. That's important of how I find in a form of mentorship to learn how others maybe have common paths or not common paths that we can learn from. So with that, we have a mic for the audience. We have one question. We have many questions. Okay, the first was right behind the gentleman in the red in the suit, and then we'll go to the you in the row ahead, and then you just to the side.
Well, fantastic. Thank you all so much for this panel and this conversation. My name is Ian Hitchcock. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student at Duke University, emphasizing in public policy, so I really appreciated the policy connection here. As someone who's also worked in community organizing, I really appreciated everything y'all have said about working at the speed of trust while also acknowledging that the frameworks in which many of us operate, whether that's a UN or the scientific community, doesn't operate on those same avenues. And also thinking about the sharing of resources, I'm wondering, given the amount of kind of money that organizations, local governments will often spend for like outside consultancies or something, is there a way or a mechanism of framing community expertise and community knowledge of these very local avenues as something like an external consultancy where people have some degree of specialized knowledge that is worth being remunerated accordingly to access as a means of getting at some of that resource sharing and building trust?
An excellent question. I think it's important to think about how we incentivize and make sure that those voices are brought in a formal way and acknowledged. Does any of the panelists want to? I see Bridget. I will hand this over to you.
Well, directly to your question about making use of community resources, I think there's a recognition now that particularly when local governments want to have representatives of poor or marginalized communities participate in surveys or in providing commentary on, plans or proposals from the government, that a lot of these folks don't have a lot of spare time. And so I think there's a growing recognition that their time needs to be compensated. And so from that perspective, I think we are moving in the right direction in terms of both recognizing the value of people's knowledge to contribute to shaping whatever policy we're trying to formulate, and we are now starting to set aside funds to compensate them. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yes, you.
Hi.
Thanks.
So my name is Alex, and I am officially a scientist that works in a non-governmental development and humanitarian organization in Mozambique. That is a southeast country of Africa. And I just wanted to kind of ask if the panel, and also bring the perspective of the global south, because much of the rhetoric about people not recognizing climate change. An illiterate farmer in Mozambique knows there's climate change because he knows his crop is not producing as well as it did. They don't need convincing, they're asking for solutions. And the comment is community science. I'm not sure if we specifically are looking for how the community, especially illiterate members of communities around the world, not just the global north, how they can engage or benefit from science? As we were saying, how do we change the jargon to something practical? Well, in Mozambique or in other developing countries, we don't need policy. We need practical solutions on knowing how to do better farming or changing fishing practices. And so are we having any changes in mentality of how scientists in the global north try to address climate change issues? Yep, thank you.
Great question. And I see Christine has her hand up first.
So this isn't really address the farmer, for example, but there are like a WCRP that just happened in Kigali, I think, right? There are efforts to try from the global north, scientists in the global north, to try to bring in scientists from the global south to train them with the right tools they need to, help the farmers or whatever. For example, there's a Earth system. There's a computer. I'm trying to not use the jargon. There's a climate model that I use. It's called a community Earth system model, and it's used to understand, seasonal predictability, or is there going to be drought this year, next year, the next year after that, or whatever. And so we put together a tutorial, for example, to try to teach, scientists in the WCRP to learn how to run this model so they could actually use it in their communities. So that is something that I think, I think it's a little bit higher level than you're asking for, but it is a way to start that, that process, because I think it's the scientists in the global south are the ones that are actually going to be the ones to communicate. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and also let me use my Asia example, because I work on the greenhouse gas, but if you go to Asia, some air pollution is more important than greenhouse gas, for example. Then I think important thing is that you brought up is that really we need to think of priority. They're also not asked to say, hey, this is the science, this is a cool model or cool measurement, you should use it. Maybe to ask, oh, this is not the greatest measurement, but it could be really useful for you. Then I think the priority is so important, so we do have that mindset. Then also that's also important for us to think about priority, you guys, the local community, to think about what does need to be done quickly in time. So I think for the more likely, I appreciate your comment, but not directly out of the question, but yeah, thank you for your comment.
Yeah, I also don't know if I have like an answer to this, but I guess my perspective is just looking at convergence research, right? Convergence science. I do have, and we can talk on the side. So one of my innovators, actually two of them, have been working directly with farmers. This is only in the U.S., and these are restrictions based on our funding, basically. Which is unfortunate, but hopefully things that are learned here can be, extracted and used in other places. One of them is doing a case study in the U.S. and also in Africa as well. So they go to farmers. They show farmers, this is what the climate models are saying that will happen with temperature, or this is what they say will happen with precipitation, and basically try to understand how are they going to cope with this. So does this mean that they need to think about new machinery, that they need to think about new crops? So they're really kind of going down to the root. That has its other issues, like we were talking earlier about scalability. So how scalable is this approach that's being done in one particular place with one particular farmer, and how that is used in other areas.
I don't have an answer to the specific question you asked, but what I think is crucial for us to do, and again, I don't know how best to do it, a lot of the climate impacts are making the land no longer viable for farming, and it's forcing people out of their homes. So much of the migrant crisis on the southern border of the U.S. is people from Central America and other areas that had, formerly been able to, survive or even make a decent living growing crops, but they can't anymore because the region's suffering from long drought or other climate impacts. And people haven't connected the dots that so much of the refugee crisis and immigration crisis is driven by climate. So, and to me, that's the other piece of it that's so destabilizing. When you look at what's happening politically across a lot of parts of the world, Amsterdam, I mean, the Netherlands, they just elected this extremist politician whose main issue is stopping immigration. So there are these kinds of political forces that will be incredibly, I think, harmful for the world in the long run. And so much of it is in response to what climate change is producing. And people aren't connecting up the dots to understand this is being driven by practices that are causing climate change. So I think that's a huge part of the education that we need to do on an ongoing basis so people can at least see the impacts of it.
And then, Amy, I don't know if you had anything to add from the ICLEI's Global Perspective Office.
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of unlocking knowledge, I would also add Indigenous groups. We need to think about how we can represent them in the exchange of information that we see, because what we've been discussing at ICLEI is how there are barriers where local and Indigenous knowledge that can't be necessarily represented as data and therefore can't be represented within an asset exchange. That creates an issue in terms of sharing that knowledge. So I think that's another group where we need to think about how we can platform their solutions and pass that on to the rest of the world. So again, sorry, not really an answer to your question, but maybe just something that we're also considering at ICLEI.
It was a wonderful question, and I'll add briefly, AGU is a global organization with about scientists in about 148 countries. And the thing about the Thriving Earth Exchange model is it's really focused on communities defining the research question. We don't go to them, they come to us. And it's a volunteer model, so it's not necessarily a funded program that implements change, but it is a volunteer role where scientists, ideally who are trained in that expertise in that country, volunteer their time to work with the community, and the community works with that scientist to really go through the process together. So if there is a very specific question that needs more science or needs guidance through science, that is one example, even just through a volunteer model, of how connections can happen and advice can be led to transform hopefully local solutions. So I wanted to add that context too to your very important question. We have about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure we had a chance for one last quick question. I'm hoping folks may be able to stick around for a few minutes for those we didn't get to in the back. But again, let's go with you, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you all so much for that. My name is Emily. I'm actually a student studying atmospheric science and climate science, so right up my alley. But my question was kind of piggybacking off of what this gentleman said, as well as kind of things that I've learned about in my studies about, how a lot of atmospheric data, for example, comes from historically and even still today countries of wealth and, the global north. And so my question is kind of, how can we leverage international science organizations or science organizations from wealthy nations to both provide more resources and technology to get even more data that can be used? And then separately, what are ways that we can look at like low cost technology that can be implemented by these communities, within these communities, et cetera? Thank you.
Wonderful question, both a data question and an ops question. So I'm going to go with Tomohiro first.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for the question. And usually those measurements are funded by national level most of the time. And if you look at the nav of the network, you can point out, oh, we put a measurement here, it's easy. But actually, it's not like that way. That's why we think the local action is so important. So for example, we have lots of the companies, for example, even satellite community, the companies come in, lots of innovator providing new technologies, and also think about the more affordable techniques. That is something we need to think about, not just national level, but at a particular level. Especially at national level, you really have lots of the consideration in there, but if you focus on local area, particular community, you need to prioritize what needs to be done. Also, they can think about what's available funding-wise or resource-wise. And that's something we wanted to advocate for the local community, even just not just a scientist, more like even company, also community-wise. We can build, maybe, I wouldn't say fundraising, but more like the self-sustained community. Companies make profit out of it, then hopefully that it's going to be self-sustained. Something I we're wishing in a GEMM community.
I guess I'll go back to WCRP, which I broke my own rule and said an acronym and didn't define it. I realized that the World Climate Research Program. It's sort of the WCRP meeting happens every I can't remember, for 10 years. It's sort of like a UN thing, but for science instead of policy. So it's sort of, I would say it's like, sort of equivalent that way. And, all worldwide, scientists will converge down into the WCRP, and there's a lot of exchange of information between Global North and Global South. And it's in these, I gave an example of the model that I talked about where they ran training sessions, but it's not just the model that my particular, organization uses. There's many different tutorials and ways of trying to advocate to get that information out there. It is sort of, it puts the onus on the scientists from the Global South to actually sign up or, be a part of it. I'm not sure what the solution is in terms of trying to do a better job of outreach there. And again, it comes down to funding, right? Where is this, yeah. But I think the training of using these tools for these communities to be able to take control of their own, science questions and, create their own data is very important. But I'm not really sure what the solution is.
I think it was in Glasgow. I heard a young woman speak, and she was part of a native community that there were many stories from the elders that were passed down about changes in the weather and the climate, and it wasn't viewed as climate science, but her argument was it should be. These are really important histories that are, in some cases passed down for many, many generations prior to the point where there were any, scientific recordings being made. So that may be something that communities can do as a way of preserving that history. Just, ask their living ancestors who, what was the weather like? How much did it rain? That kind of thing, and begin to build that kind of repository for communities that have been not understood to have really valuable historical knowledge.
Great, and I want to see if Amy wanted the last word for this, or?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I would just say really briefly, I think digital finance is a great way to unlock resources at the local level to invest back into community science. There was a great example in West Berkshire. They, via a digital crowdfunding platform, they managed to raise funds to implement sustainable projects in their local area, but it was also very community driven because it was the community who were feeding into the process in terms of the decisions that were made, which projects were selected. So I think digital finance definitely holds so much potential and is already being utilized in lots of cases. Probably don't have time to go into them, but yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Excellent. Well, I also wanted to do a quick plug. Next Wednesday, 6 December, there will also be a session in this room on open science. So hopefully you can continue this conversation there. But with that, we are out of time. I wanted to thank you all for joining us here on day one. I also wanted to thank all of these panelists, both here in person and virtual, for their incredible insights and engaging in this important dialogue of how we can further bridge science, communities, and of course the solutions we need for climate. So enjoy the rest of your COP and take care. Bye-bye.